Hello higher historians and welcome to the first lesson for issue 2 of the Migration and Empire Scottish topic. Issue 2 is all about the immigrant groups in Scotland, so we're going to start off by looking at the Irish for this particular lesson. Now the Irish we split into two groups. They have the Catholic Irish and the Protestant Irish, so we're going to start with the Catholic Irish just now. So the Catholic Irish obviously came to Scotland at the same point in time as quite a lot of other people, and their experiences might be quite similar to some of the other groups that we're looking at, which is what you're going to find with this issue, but there are some key differences and it is important that you know about each of these. If in the exam you're asked to talk about an individual group, then you can talk about them. So for example, if it was a question that specifically referred to the Catholic Irish, then that would be what you would talk about and you wouldn't speak about any other group. If it referred to the Irish in general, you could talk about both Protestant and Catholic, and if it referred to just immigrant groups, you can talk about any one that we look at within issue 2. So the areas, as you can see from the little map at the start, that the Catholic Irish tended to go to is places like Glasgow, some in Dundee and Edinburgh and things like that, and we'll have a look at that in more detail. So the task for this week and for this issue in general is for you to make a mini fact file on each of the different immigrant groups. So for this PowerPoint, it's going to be about the Catholic Irish. Now you can do this any way you sort of feel comfortable with it, but it is important it's somewhere that you can access it. So you can do it in your jotter. You might want to use like paper and things like that to make a little kind of A5 booklet with a cover page that says Catholic Irish and then any other information in it. You might decide to do it as like a poster page in a jotter and then have notes. You might decide to do it kind of just as bullet points under headings and do the headings in different colours, or whatever you want to do. Do what you think is going to be best, but maybe try to make it a little bit more interesting looking than just pick up a pen or pencil and write the information in. Make it stand out a little bit. So use highlighters or use different colours and doodles and things like that for the headings. Make sure that the information stands out a little bit. I would really recommend doing like a poster page for each group so that you finish issue 1's information, you've got your explain question information, and then you've got a poster page for issue 2, and then a poster page, say, for the Catholic Irish. And then you've got your information about them, a new poster page for the next group that we're going to look at, and so forth as you go through the issue. And in that way it's really easy for you to find your notes on the different groups, and your headings are really, really clear rather than just everything written in one colour. So take a little bit of time to put whatever you're going to do together. Go look for paper and things like that, and when you come back to it, this is what we're going to be looking at. So Catholic Irish in Scotland under the following headings. We've got reasons for moving to Scotland, where they lived while they were in Scotland, what employment opportunities and things that they maybe had and what jobs they did, what their housing conditions and things were like, so what their living conditions were like, and then the relationships that they ultimately had with the Scots. So that's what we're looking for. Make sure you give yourself plenty of space because there's quite a lot of information, but again, you're just looking for the key facts. So this map is a really good way to kind of just introduce the topic. There's going to be one like this on each slide, and you might want to take a screenshot of it and put it into your notes, or print it out, just this one slide, and put the information in where that is. If you want to just leave some space when we go back to school, I'll make sure that this slide in particular is available for everyone, and you can stick it in then, but it gives you kind of just a wee recap of things. So a lot of Irish immigrants came over to Scotland every year. It wasn't just a case of they were coming over just at this one period that we're looking at. They sometimes came over to Scotland to work during harvest times, and then they went back to Ireland and came back over during the harvest time the next year. The part we're looking at where they start to move and permanently settle in Scotland, a lot of them settling in Glasgow purely because this was where they landed first, so it was an area that they got off the boat and there was a lot of work to be done there. Areas nearby as well things like Paisley, Stirling, Greenock, Kilmarnock, all of these places would have attracted the people because, again, there was work available for them. So you might find that they landed in Glasgow, got off of the boat and stayed there, or some of them would have gone to Kilmarnock or Stirling looking for job opportunities if they couldn't find something in Glasgow itself. The southern sort of western areas, like Ayrshire for example, are quite close to Ireland, sort of geographically, so again a lot of people you're finding are going there as well. If you were a navvy, which is the group of migrant people who moved from place to place and they built railways and canals and things like that, you might find yourself travelling all over Scotland and just working wherever that route in particular took you, so they moved everywhere. Dundee and Angus in particular are huge attractions for especially female Irish people, but people in general, to work in the factories and the textile industries. So Cox's mill and Baxter's mill and things in Dundee, and also things like Wilkie's factory would have been a really huge attraction to these people to come in. Edinburgh, lots of job opportunities in the factories and things there, so some people moving there. And you've got things like mines and things like that in Lanarkshire and in places like Coatbridge and stuff like that, attracting miners to go and move there, or iron workers. 1861, so towards the kind of period that we're talking about here in the 60s of sort of 1800s, you've got 45% of the coal miners and 47% of the iron workers living in Coatbridge of Irish descent. So we know that there are a lot of them moving in and out and around these places. So these are the kind of places that they ultimately went to and why they went there. So we're going to look at this in a wee bit more detail. Like I said, you can pause the video here, roughly about 7 minutes and 7 seconds, and you can copy this into your jotter. If you want to just leave some space for it, that's fine, or take a screenshot of it and stick that in later on, that's completely fine as well. So reasons for moving. So this would be your first heading, so put this first heading, highlight it, do a little doodle of some sort, put it so it's obvious that you can see it, and then we're going to use the information on the next couple of slides to write some key points down. You can bullet point it, you can do it as sort of little mind maps and things like that, but there is a lot of information and some examples, so you're going to have to make sure that you take the key points, don't write everything, okay? And I'll try and highlight some key points for you as we go. So obviously we've talked about the idea of Irish people leaving Ireland due to the potato famine. So there's a lot of different reasons why the Catholic Irish actually came to Scotland, but probably the most well known is this idea of escaping the devastating impact that the potato famine was having on the people of Ireland at this point in time. So it sweeps across Europe in the 1840s, it kills roughly about 1 million Irish people, and it encourages about 1 million more to actually leave. And you can see what an example of a slightly infected potato plant actually looks like in the bottom corner there. That's where it's only just become infected. Some of them eventually, when they actually did dig them up, the infection had spread throughout the potato completely and it would have turned black and been really awful and horrible. So, you know, for this key point we might say something like the most well known is the need to escape the potato famine, and just take that key point as a reason why they would have left Ireland. So again, we're not looking to write everything down, but key point there. You could even add in that killed around 1 million Irish people if you wanted to, as a key point. Also, another reason for people leaving, if you think about what you can see in this picture here, would have been kind of the levels of abject poverty that they're living in. So this is a house and obviously this man's family, all of them living together in one space. There's not an awful lot of furniture. You can kind of see that it doesn't look particularly clean. It's not well lit and things like that. So the general living conditions in Ireland were really bad as well, which did often result in a lot of people leaving Ireland to come to someplace else. It wasn't always necessarily Scotland, but Scotland was a really good stopping point because it was so close to Ireland. It was really easy to get to, it was really cheap to get to, and there was jobs available. So some people didn't actually come and stay permanently. They came over and they worked for a little while, and then they went to places like America, Canada, other places as well. But poverty is a big point for this. John Ingalls, who obviously visited Ireland in roughly about 1836, he is looking at the living conditions of these people, and one of the things that he went on record saying is quoted here. He says, "It was neither air nor watertight, and had no bedstead and no furniture excepting a stool or a pot. There were not even the embers of a fire. In this hut there was a woman with 5 children. Her husband was a labourer. The family had had a pig, but it had been taken for rent a few days before." So he's talking about this idea again, not much furniture, a lot of children and family members all living in these one sort of roomed huts. If that pig had still been there, it is very likely that it would have been actually in the house as well. Think about the black houses in the Scottish Highlands, you know, the animals and stuff being there as well. So not particularly a nice thing. He kind of hints on this bit as well, that the labourer that is her husband is working, obviously, but they weren't able to pay their rent, so they've had to get rid of their pig in order to make that payment. So poverty, again, being a really key theme that we're talking about here. You don't have to write any of these bits down so far, just kind of give you a bit of a background point. So, thinking cap point, why were the Irish people actually so poor? What about poverty as a key point made them leave Ireland especially, but why were they living in this condition to begin with? So these are the kind of points you can now put into your fact file. So the lack of industry is definitely one big thing. Ireland is an agrarian economy, which means it is very reliant on, I'd put that heading as well actually, it means it's very reliant on growing things and on farming and things like that to help supply the economy. And there are no growing industries which was able to provide work for people that were not able to work on the land for various reasons. So lack of industry was a main reason why people would live in poverty, certainly, but that is a main reason why they would leave Ireland. There was a lack of industry there, but there was industry opportunities in other places, especially the growing cities and things of Scotland, which were a massive attraction for some of them. It also meant that there was maybe factory work that they could do, even if they were not skilled labourers. They would not maybe get paid very much for working on the land. There was not really opportunity for them to move into the cities like we did in Scotland from the Highlands, so they went elsewhere to try and find these opportunities. Also, Ireland has an increasing population, which, again, I'm highlighting not particularly well, but that would be a key point for you to put down. The Irish population is growing rapidly. There's a lot of children being born and a lot of mouths to then feed. In the sort of 50 years before 1841, which is where you start to sort of see potato famine and things hitting Ireland, the population had actually doubled in the space of 50 years to over 8 million people. But the industry hadn't helped develop any further than this, and the land was still being shared by all these people. So this meant that there was more people working on the same areas of land, there's more mouths to feed, there's more people then having to try and crowd into these areas, which leads to kind of more poverty and things like that as well, and is another reason why you maybe want to move out of Ireland to go someplace else. In terms of the technology, you've got landlords trying to make their own lands kind of bigger. So landlords tried to make their own lands bigger in order to use these more modern farming methods and techniques. This meant that any smallholders were evicted from the land because they were no longer needed, very similar to what had happened during the Highland clearances in Scotland. So this meant people would then leave Ireland and move someplace else. Self-sufficiency is a big reason that they left. Basically, most Irish people tried to live off of whatever they could produce on these tiny, tiny plots of land. Generally speaking, in sort of 1841, 45%, so nearly half of these sort of little farms where this is what they're trying to do, were only about 1.5 acres in size. It's not particularly big, and it is very difficult if you're trying to grow crops in land, which makes much more sense, in these sort of small areas, and trying to keep enough crop that you can sell to make money to pay your rent, but also to eat, is a very difficult sort of situation. Obviously, back to the population increase, as this population does increase, you've got to divide these plots of land further and further up. So you're getting smaller and smaller and smaller plots of land, but the demands on you are not getting any smaller, and in fact they're getting bigger because you now need to grow food to pay your rent, but food for more and more and more people to actually be able to eat and survive off of. So this was a reason why they moved, to gain employment opportunities where they wouldn't have to kind of do that. They could get enough money from working to pay for their rent and to buy food and things like that. And Ireland wasn't going to do that for them, so Scotland was an obvious place for them to go. Also, rents are really, really high. Very, very few Irish people actually own their land. And from the little that they actually do have and do earn, they have to pay their rent. Now, their landlords quite often are living elsewhere, so they're not actually interested in what's happening on their homes. They are just wanting their rent paid, so they're kind of almost faceless in a way. They don't really know their tenants, they're not really interested in their struggles or anything about them. And if the tenants did actually make improvements to their homes and things like that, then the rents went up, which was a very serious issue. If tenants couldn't pay their rent, then they were evicted. And it didn't matter if you had been a rent payer for years and years and had never had an issue. When you start to be unable to pay, they will just replace you, because there's always people waiting and ready to move into that piece of land, and that particular group of people will take over quite quickly. Also, at this point in time, the government in Ireland is actually being governed by London, so the people actually don't really know what is going on and what life is like in Ireland. So this is a key point that I'm not highlighting very well, but you should write that one down for the government. So this meant that life was difficult, but it was very unlikely to be able to improve because the people were not seeing firsthand the suffering that the people were going through in Ireland. So again, it just encouraged people to move and to go elsewhere, especially to Scotland, as it was just an obvious choice for them to move to. Other problems: unemployment, as we've said, was very high, and wages in general were lower than other places, especially Scotland. For the same jobs, you could quite often earn 10 times the amount in Scotland that you were earning in Ireland. So a lot of people moved for that reason. And there's an awful lot, for the Catholic Irish in particular, of these anti-Catholic laws in Ireland, which meant that if you were a Catholic, you could not necessarily access education, so you couldn't actually make yourself any more skilled or anything like that, or even learn to read or write in some occasions. And you were also prohibited from buying land, so Catholics couldn't own their own land, you had to rent. So there's no opportunity really for you there, whereas in Scotland you could go to school, you could actually gain skills and qualifications, and you could own your own land if you got lucky. or at least you could own your own property if you had enough money. So that was a reason why they would leave to go to Scotland. Obviously, poverty and famine means that disease spreads really rapidly, and as a result of this, a lot of the Catholic Irish people are in ill health. They're unlikely to survive a trip elsewhere at that current state. So going to America, which is one some people did, was not always an opportunity for everyone. Scotland is perfect. It is a perfect solution for this group of people because it is close to Ireland, as you can see by the map there, and it's really easy to get to. You get on a boat, you get off in Glasgow or one of the other ports, and you are done. That's it. It takes very little time, and it's also really very, very cheap. Tickets on a boat to Scotland from Ireland are cheap, and even a lot of the very poor people, they would sometimes have to sell all of their belongings to afford it, but they could make enough money to get these tickets to Scotland, whereas other places were maybe completely out of their price range. So this was a main reason for that. How many eventually came? It's definitely increased significantly during the 19th century. So in 1841 there is roughly around 126,000 Irish-born people in Scotland. In the space of 40 years it's almost double that, to 219,000. You don't have to write this slide, but it's kind of just to give you an idea of how many people actually came from Ireland to Scotland. Now these would be both Protestant and Catholic Irish, but it is a huge number of people moving and choosing to move to Scotland. Okay, so pause the video here and make sure you've got all of the notes that you need from the first section, roughly about 21:43, and then start the video again for the next section. So the next bit that we're looking at is where they lived. So this is your new heading, where they lived. Again, put a heading, highlight it, do a wee doodle, something that helps you remember about it. So obviously when they first come to Scotland in general, they're going to move to places where there are jobs available, or they're moving to places that are not too far from Ireland. Now this normally means the west coast, which is what we saw in the map at the start of the PowerPoint. The ones that actually go further into Scotland tend to do so because they have friends or family that are living there and encourage them to come and stay with them, or they know that they'll get a job because their friends and family have told them that they will. So key points there about the arrival point. Again, I'm going through this quite quickly, but at any point just feel free to pause the video and note down what you need from this. Most of the Catholic Irish settled then in areas such as Glasgow, Ayrshire or Lanarkshire, which were close to the ports and had jobs in the factories and in mining. So close to the ports and had jobs in factories and things as well. When they actually arrived, they tended to go and stay with other Irish families until they could afford a place of their own. Now, this actually resulted in a lot of negative feelings from the Scottish people, which we'll come back to, but it made them think that the Irish were not actually happy to mix with them or with other people in Scotland, and it started them off on a very negative foot right from the very, very beginning. Also, the fact that the Scottish people were seeing so many people arriving in these places was quite frightening and worrisome, especially because conditions in Scotland were definitely better than in Ireland in some ways, but were not great anyway. So this encouraged a lot of people to feel really nervous and worried about that. Again, pause the video, make sure you've got the information about that, and then start your next heading about employment at roughly 24 and 22. Make sure you put this heading, put information, a doodle, highlight it, make it stand out. Okay, so employment. Now, like we said at the very beginning, Irish immigration to Scotland to find work is not a new thing. It has been happening for a very long time, well before the famine. Thousands of Irish people just generally travelled to Scotland to work on the farms during the busy harvest times as extra labourers. These would have been males and females, and it was quite a common occurrence for that to happen. Local areas that we are looking at, in particular things like Kirriemuir and things as well, that would have been a common occurrence in some of the farms and things around about where we are in Angus and things as well. Some of them came at various times to find work. A really interesting fact that you can put down as an example, in the summer of 1841, there was roughly about 57,651 Irish people, mainly male labourers, coming across to England and Scotland to work on the harvest that year, and that's from the records of people at the ports and things asking why people were coming in. So lots of people actually coming in and doing that and working on these areas. So obviously not all Irish people are going to come and necessarily work as labourers. Some of them in the agricultural areas and things did. They went back to Ireland after they had worked for a while and got some money the way they had done for years. Some of them obviously stayed and worked there, and others did other things. So a lot of them went and moved to areas like Dundee and Greenock, where they became dock workers, for example. In Glasgow, they found work in the factories and the shipyards. The Irish navvies then moved around Scotland, like we said in the map at the start, and built the railways and the canals and the roads and things as well. So moving around a lot and doing a lot of work there. A lot of them found jobs in the Scottish heavy industries in particular, so mining communities in Fife, in Lothian, Ayrshire and Lanarkshire offered a lot of job opportunities for them. And obviously there was still things like steel industry and things like that in Lanarkshire as well that they could be involved in. Others, especially women, at first at least, went to Dundee to factory work and things like the jute industry, so like Cox's Mill and things like that. Factory work was a very common thing that they could actually do, even in Edinburgh, where they had an Irish population but a smaller one. Many actually did factory work and things like that in these growing industries, which they would never have had the opportunity to do in Ireland, but they could do in Scotland during this industrial development phase. Other Catholics that were Irish came over and set up their own businesses and companies. A really good example is Thomas Lipton, who you can see pictured here. He was the son of an Irish immigrant, and he set up a tea shop and like a sort of tea room and a grocer's shop in Glasgow, which then helped launch the Lipton name. He then, later on, his family would immigrate to America and things like that as well, and take this business worldwide. So Lipton tea, you might know the Lipton iced tea and things like that. This name comes from this sort of original business being set up. How were they actually perceived during this point in time? Well, not particularly well. They, at least some of them, had a very limited sort of education, and often they didn't actually speak English, or they did, but they spoke very little English, and it wasn't particularly great, with Gaelic being the main sort of language. So this meant that they had to take, again, low-paid jobs, but the jobs that they were doing were getting more money in Scotland than the same jobs would have been in Ireland. And as a result, a lot of the Irish workers, especially the Catholic ones, were taunted and ridiculed at work, which was a barrier to them mixing with the Scots. Now, the reason that we talk about being the Catholics, and we'll come back to, is because Scotland was a Protestant country at this point in time. So there was a lot of anti-Catholic feeling in general, and the Irish, unfortunately, just happened to fall victim to that. Also, because they would work for whatever pay that they could actually get, many Scots saw them as job stealers and believed that they were losing wages and jobs to these Irish people, and this made them really angry about the Irish people taking jobs. We will come back to this in that section, but it is key for you to kind of note that as well. Okay, so pause it at roughly 2950, finish that section, and come back to housing conditions. So again, new heading, housing conditions. Make a wee doodle, do a wee diagram, highlight it, make it stand out a wee bit, and we're looking at the other sections. Now, because of the level of poverty many Irish people faced, when they actually came to Scotland, they could only afford to live in areas with the poorest quality of housing. This quite often resulted in overcrowding and definitely in poor sanitation. But it is worthwhile noting that the Scottish people are living in these conditions as well. It's not just a case of that the immigrants were moved into immigrant areas in Scotland and the housing conditions were horrible. Scottish people were living alongside them in similar conditions, and they wanted it to change, but it is better than what they were maybe living in Ireland in some ways, but everyone's in the same situation, and you're going to find this with all of the immigrant groups that we look at. They are all living in these same situations. By 1871, roughly about 41% of Irish families lived in what we call single ends, which are one-roomed houses. You can see two pictures here where pretty much everything would happen in that one room. You would have a bed, you would have your cooking area, if you were lucky enough to have one of those, and your bathing area and things like that would literally be the same area. There is no other separate rooms and things like that. Sometimes this would be up to 12 to 15 people living in one single end. There was an investigation in the 1850s in Edinburgh in their small Irish immigrant population, and they actually found that it could be up to 15 in just this one house. Overcrowding was a very serious issue that they had to deal with and contend with. You can kind of see what a tenement building would maybe look like in this sort of diagram. There is actually basement houses and things like that. There are, each of these individual rooms might be two rooms that a family has, or it's just one that they have. So it'd be very, very crowded in one building with very little chance to get any sort of extra air or space. Some of these ones on this side are kind of two-room areas or bigger areas. They've got a lot of space, so they would maybe have these sort of spaces and then a bedroom, whereas these ones here are definitely single end sort of houses where it's just one room that they're actually having to deal with. That's a terrible highlighting idea, but you can see the difference between the two groups. Obviously, a lot of Irish people are living in very dirty conditions then, because of the fact that their homes are very cheaply built, very poorly built as well. There's damp, it's quite drafty and things as well. Quite often, because of the window taxes, you'd have to pay extra for having a window, so they were often bricked or boarded up, so there's not a lot of ventilation and things like that. They would share toilets with other families and things, and you can see the sort of the outdoor yard areas where toilets would be, and they often didn't actually have running water or things like that in the home. That would be a tap or a pump that would be in the street or locally that they would have to go to get any share of water and things. So the conditions are not great. Scottish people living in them as well, but not particularly great. As a result of these poor conditions, disease was a problem that many immigrants faced. Illnesses like smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis affected them and spread more easily due to the fact it was massively overcrowded. And they tended to get the blame for these conditions as well. When we talk about the Jewish community, we'll talk about that again, but they tended to be blamed for disease being spread as if they had brought it. And the Irish as well had this idea of being dirty and had brought these diseases with them, when the reality was that they had existed in Scotland and did exist in Scotland and were spread just the same way due to the living conditions. Regardless of who it was that was living in them, the diseases spread anyway. Some of the poorest actual housing would have had things like midden heaps in the shared back garden areas. You can see a picture of one here. Basically, that's where they put their rubbish and emptied out human waste and things like that. It was a horrible sort of smell. It would attract rats and things like that. And as you can imagine, if it rained, it would just wash everything all over the garden area where the children are playing and the people are hanging out their washing and things like that. So again, not a particularly nice set of conditions, attracting these vermin and things like that. Not a nice place to live, really. Okay, so pause at 35 and 10, finish your notes on the information, and come back to personal identity. So new heading, personal identity again, doodle, make it stand out, highlight it, okay, and have information about that using the next couple of slides. So as we said, on their arrival, quite often they were not particularly well received. They were Catholic, which we've been talking about, which meant that they had their own religions and customs, and the Scottish people saw them as alien. They were moving into a Protestant country where Catholicism was not well received, and they didn't actually want it to be there. So the Catholic religion was actually a really key point for the Irish Catholic people, and the 1800s saw more Catholic churches open across Scotland than had ever been. Now, there were Scottish people, especially in the Highland areas as well, that were Catholic, even though Scotland itself was predominantly a Protestant country. But the Catholic religion was a really key point to the personal identities of this particular Irish group of immigrants. They were allowed to continue with their worshipping in ways that were familiar to them. They had Irish priests who would hold masses, and at first this might be just in halls or things like that until churches could be built. The priests were key to the Catholic Irish people's way of life because they helped them in ways other than just religious sort of reasons and things. The ones that could only speak Gaelic, the priests often helped them. It could be that they were a focal point as a church for the Catholic communities, especially if you just arrived in Scotland as an immigrant. You could get help from the Catholic Church, and it was a key point for you. They would maybe give you other help. For example, priests could help you find jobs or to find housing, or to even just find another family within the community for you to stay with until you could find your own homes and houses. They developed schools for the Catholic children because they had difficulty actually being accepted in schools and things like that, which were funded by the church until the 1850s. They were given the chance to join the state system at that point in 1872, but they refused because they couldn't guarantee that the religious element was being taught, which was a key point for them. It was a very central focused point of their identity. The church wasn't just about being just for religious services either, or just to get help for jobs and things. It was a place where you could come together as a community. It held dances and other social events where you could mix, and you would maybe meet your future wife or husband if you were single, or you could just meet family members or new friends and things as well. So it was a social gathering place. Football teams were started up as a result of the need for the Catholic Church to provide social activities and also to fund their charity work. So Catholic teams that were set up were things like Celtic, Hibs and Dundee United, for example, whereas the Protestant did the same thing, and they set up teams like Rangers, Hearts and Dundee, and those things, kind of the rivalry between those groups today, are still seen now because of this initial rivalry between those two groups, the Protestant and the Catholics, but we'll come back to that briefly. It was a social life thing. They had youth groups, they had Sunday schools, the church was kind of the focus point for all of that, and they also had charitable things where you could go if you needed help. So they had soup kitchens, they ran things like the St Vincent de Paul Society and the League of the Cross, which could help you with food and clothing and furniture and things like that, and to help with rent if you were falling behind and stuff as well. So it was more than just a religious aspect for these people. It was the soul of their community and the main focal point of their personal identity that they kept with them when they moved to Scotland. In terms of importance of the priests themselves, we've got a great quote here. A factory inspector in 1841 records this. He says, "The influence of the priests from their constant dealings with their congregation, their knowledge of everyone in sickness and in health, and their continual devotion to their wants and interests, both spiritual and material, is deservedly very great." So they were key people, these Catholic priests, in this just general overview of these people and what their life was like in Scotland, and trying to maintain their personal identities. The priests were kind of the focal point, and the church was the focal point for. A Catholic priest himself in the 1930s in Scotland, so right at the end of our topic, said religion was the only security they had, because they hadn't much of the world's goods, and they found comfort and strength in their religion. They also found security in that they could go to the local priest and he was there to assist them with problems like writing letters, getting houses, jobs, and so on. The church afforded them an opportunity to meet their fellow countrymen. They were able to rely on each other, so it was the key point to their identity and their community. Okay, pause it at roughly about 41 and 7 seconds. Finish your notes on personal identity and then come back for the relationships with the Scots, which is our last section here. Again, put the heading, key points, highlight it, do a doodle, make sure it stands out, and then use the slides that follow to fill in your information. So as we've kind of already said, the Irish Catholics in Scotland really did face a very negative reaction from the Scottish people, and there was a few reasons for this. It created anti-Irish feelings, anti-Catholic feelings as well. A lot of the time it's because many of them who arrived were very poor. That meant they would need charity from Scotland, which a lot of people didn't like. They wore rags, so it made them look common and unclean and just generally not someone that you wanted to associate with. They were often accused of drinking in excess and encouraging Scottish people to drink a lot of alcohol, which again made them very negative. Because in Ireland there had been fights and rivalry between the Catholics and the Protestants, there was a very negative impression on the Catholics coming into a Protestant country, like they were going to try and take over and things like that. And sometimes they had sort of street battles between rival Protestant and Catholic groups, which again gave this impression that they were violent and aggressive. And these religious differences caused a lot of argument with the Scottish people as well, who were Protestant and saw these Irish Catholics as coming in and taking over, or trying to take over. A lot of Scottish people were worried that the Catholic religion would spread and were afraid of the loyalty to a foreign leader the Catholics seemed to have, so basically the Pope. Some groups actually worked to promote Protestantism, including the Scottish Reformation Society and the Orange Order, against these Catholic people. Even the Church of Scotland actually published a report in 1923 where they called them the menace of the Irish race to our Scottish nationality. Basically they refer to them as a menace, which this idea of them being against the Irish is very clear to see. The Catholics faced discrimination in schools, and the Catholic teachers sometimes couldn't find work because they were Catholic. So they opened their own schools, which we've talked about as well, until 1918 after the war, when the British government took them over and they agreed to allow religious teaching to continue. Employment was an issue, which caused arguments with the Scots, which we have said already. Because many Irish were uneducated or low skilled, the Scottish people believed that it led to lower wages for everybody, because they couldn't actually go on strike to try and improve their working conditions or their wages, because all their employers would do was bring in the Irish people as strike breakers, because they would be willing to work even though the Scottish people wanted more wages. The Irish would be willing to work for the low wages because, again, it was higher than it would have been in Ireland. So they were hated for those reasons and hated as the strike breakers as well. The poor living conditions were common for Scottish people as well. However, it still caused resentment because many Irish lived in the sort of the poorest, the very, very poorest of the housing. And so the sight of these new arrivals led to Scottish people complaining there's just not enough space, there's not enough room. A lot of these sort of reasons and reactions are quite common to things you might have heard today based on any groups coming into Scotland. It's not different arguments, it's just different people. However, there is always a group of people that will support it, and there were some people in Scotland that did actually welcome more Irish immigrants to come in. The Scottish Catholics supported the arrival of these people who shared their religious beliefs, especially because it helped the Catholic Church to grow in Scotland, so they were really, really positive about these people coming in. Irish immigrants were also welcomed by friends and family who lived in Scotland, so they were happy to see them as well. Other Scottish people began to kind of improve relations with the Irish when they fought alongside each other during the Great War, so during World War I, and they were not caring that they were Catholic Irish any longer because they were all in the trenches and fighting together, and this increased the just general acceptance and assimilation is the word that we use for that as well, of the Irish people to the Scots and the Scottish people to the Irish. Employers also wanted to see more Irish immigrants, and sometimes they actually advertised in Ireland to attract them to Scotland or paid for their travel, because more workers meant that there would be fewer skills or labour shortages, especially if we're talking about later on Scottish people leaving Scotland to go to other places. There needed to be someone coming in to take these jobs, so that was quite positive. Over time, many Irish people then become involved in trade unions and politics, like setting up the Scottish Labour Party, and basically worked to improve the working and social conditions for everybody in Scotland, which helped improve the relations between the Scots and the Irish as well. So, stop the video, pause it, go back, make sure you've got all of your information about the Irish under the headings that we talked about, and that you've got some examples and things as well.